Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Heritage Talks, a program by the Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network. My name is Heather Darch, and I'm a project director for Quan. Our series this year has been called Sharing Our Heritage, and we've been talking to people from across Quebec's heritage and cultural communities to tell us their inspiring stories. And it's been a great series as we've been introduced to people who work or volunteer in historical societies, museums, archives, in community organizations, and in cultural groups across the province. Their programs and exhibitions and projects are inspirational, and they are making a positive difference in their communities. Our audience have been very keen to learn about the history and heritage of different regions of Quebec and the efforts being made to protect and preserve their stories, objects, and places that are so important to Quebec's history. Quan is a nonprofit organization whose mission is to preserve and protect the history of Quebec in general, but of English-speaking peoples in particular. And of course, you're very welcome to join our network if you'd like. At the moment, we have a 30% discount on for first-time new members for a one-year membership. And membership gives you access to all sorts of programs and fun events, and to our quarterly publication called Quebec Heritage News. And so if you're interested, I encourage you to please go to our website at qahn.org and click on our membership page and sign up to become a part of our super network full of people and organizations who are making a difference in keeping history and heritage alive. I'd like to thank our funders for this series, Canadian Heritage, the Zeller Family Foundation, and the Townshippers Foundation. All of our presentations are recorded, so if you've missed any of them, you can go to our public Facebook page or to Quan's YouTube channel and find all of the presentations, including this one this evening. If you're joining us on Zoom tonight, please keep your camera turned off during the presentation. You may turn it back on at the end of our presenter's talk. In fact, we would encourage you to do so we can create a community and we can open the dialogue for questions and answers. But if you have comments, we'd like you to please use the comment box at the bottom of your screen. Or if you would like to talk to Sunita in person, please use the reactions button and the raise hand feature. So that we can unmute you and you can ask your question. And if you're joining us on Facebook, we'd love for you for you to tell us where you're watching from and your connection to the South Asian community in Quebec. Well, I'll introduce you to our guest speaker tonight. Sunita holds a PhD in English from McGill University and completed a 2-year SSHRC postdoctoral fellowship in theater and performance studies at York University in 2021. Sunita Nigam has published on the racial, gender, and class dimensions of performance and culture in Quebec and Mexico, including stand-up comedy, blackface minstrelsy, burlesque, activist theater, and urban design campaigns. Beyond her academic work, Sunita works as a consultant in the community sector across Quebec. We welcome Dr. Sunita Nigam tonight with her talk, Being South Asian in Quebec, a new online exhibit from the Rang Collective. Hello, Sunita, and welcome to Heritage Talks.
Thank you so much, Heather. It's very nice to be here with all of you this evening. I'm just about to share my screen, so okay, there we go. Heather, please let me know if there's any issue with the screen sharing, but hopefully you can all see my slides that I've prepared for you for this evening. So good evening, everybody. Thank you to Quan for the invitation to come speak with you tonight about this new online exhibition I've been working on called Being South Asian in Quebec, which I've created for and with a collective called Rung, Arts for Solidarity. This exhibition has been made possible with funding from Quebec Anglophone Heritage Network and the English Language Arts Network. The Rung Collective is a Teotihuacan or Montreal-based collective and registered nonprofit, non-hierarchical organization for the arts of South Asia, founded in 2021. We are a group of academics, artists, and activists of South Asian descent living in Quebec and working to create dialogue around social justice issues for marginalized South Asian communities through cultural events across the province. I'd like to give you a sense of some of the events that Rung has been organizing before turning to the exhibition at hand. These include a 2023 screening of the acclaimed BBC documentary film, India, the Modi Question, at the Tisri Dunya Theatre Space in Montreal. This was done in partnership with Tisri Dunya, the South Asia Research and Resource Center in Montreal, and the nonprofit webzine Montreal Sarai. In 2022, Rung organized a screening of Sabiha Sumar's film Kamosh Pani in Saguenay, a film about the effects of the partition of British India in Punjab. This was organized in partnership with Regard sur le Monde and with funding from the English Language Arts Network. In January of this year, Rung organized a screening of Zindagi Tamasha by Sarmad Kusat at Brick by Brick, a nonprofit organization and community space founded in 2016 by community organizers of color in the Park Extension neighborhood of Montreal. This Pakistani film is about a man in Lahore struggling with gender norms and the attitudes of his society. Last April, we organized the first installation of the Screening South Asia film series with a film screening of short South Asian films at Restaurant Shalimar in Lennoxville in the Eastern Townships, after which the audience participated in an open discussion with written artistic responses. And here we have a photo from a panel on the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts' new Kapani Sikh art collection with Rung Collective founding member, Professor Pasha M. Khan. So that's the Rung Collective as of now. And with our new exhibition on the topic of being South Asian in Quebec, we seek to address what academics who specialize in the South Asian community in Quebec think of as the political and social invisibility of this population. Indeed, in their 2021 edited collection, The Invisible Community, Being South Asian in Quebec, editors Masha Bakshay, Mary McAndrew, Ratna Ghosh, and Preeti Singh argue that although Statistics Canada predicts that the South Asian population will be the main visible minority group in Quebec in 2036, and while the South Asian diaspora is gaining major political and cultural visibility across the globe, South Asians have remained a largely invisible group in Quebec's cultural and political imaginary. In the rest of Canada, the experiences and histories of South Asians are being represented with some regularity in academia and the media alike, but this is not the case in Quebec. Rung's new exhibit, Being South Asian in Quebec, seeks to visibilize some of the histories that have shaped South Asian presence in Quebec and to give space to some of the diverse experiences that make up our dynamic versions of what it feels, looks, and means to be South Asian in Quebec. This exhibition is divided into two parts. Section 1, Histories, offers a series of historical snapshots and theoretical frameworks for thinking about South Asian histories in Quebec. And Section 2, Stories, gathers together original life writing and, in some cases, choreographies and interviews from different South Asian Quebecers about their experiences living in Quebec. As a third-generation Indian settler Quebecer on one side and fourth and fifth generation Irish and Serbian and British settler Quebecer on the other, my own experiences of being South Asian in Quebec have been complex and are not representative of the experiences of most other South Asian Quebecers that I know. Still, many individuals within the South Asian diaspora in Canada and Quebec find ourselves negotiating our identities as both settlers, usually on unceded indigenous territories, and as migrants or descendants of migrants who left their homelands in search of safer or more secure lives. In many cases, South Asians in Quebec and their families have landed here after fleeing war, persecution, economic precarity, or other social struggles back home that have been shaped by ongoing legacies of European colonialism. With being South Asian in Quebec, Rung invites readers to engage with the diverse histories and testimonies gathered within the exhibition using a readerly mode that resists generalization, adopting instead a renewing curiosity about the diverse loves, losses, and longings that animate the lives of South Asians living across this part of Turtle Island, now known as Quebec. Through the histories and stories collected in this online resource, we hope to plant seeds for future conversations, research, activist interventions, and artistic responses. Beyond making the realities of Quebec's South Asians more vivid within the province's cultural and political imaginary at large, we hope this exhibition will serve as a place for South Asian Quebecers to share, reflect, critique, commemorate, commiserate, celebrate, and activate. I'll now provide you with some of the sociological and historical contexts into which Rung's new online exhibit is intervening, and which is also explained in the introductory sections of the exhibit itself. Far from representing a homogeneous group, the South Asian diaspora, a term used to describe the scattering of a people away from their ancestral homeland, includes a diversity of peoples hailing from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Afghanistan, Bhutan, and the Maldives. One of the most linguistically diverse places on the planet, South Asia has 4 language families comprised of 650 distinct languages. The survival of many of these languages is all the more impressive considering the centuries of especially British, but also French, Dutch, and Portuguese colonial rule across the region. Notably, South Asia tends to prefer bi, tri, and plurilingualism rather than simply tolerate it. In fact, as linguist Suresh Khanna Jaraja writes, quote, "There has been a plurilingual tradition of communication in South Asia since pre-colonial times, and local scholars consider plurilingualism as natural to the ecology of this region," unquote. South Asia is also a place of great religious diversity. Hinduism, Islam, Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Christianity are some of the many religions practiced across the region. Thus, South Asians are far less a coherent community than they are part of a geographic, cultural, and economic network characterized by difference, dynamism, displacement, and exchange. One of the world's largest diasporas, the South Asian diaspora, today comprises over 50 million people. A recurring theme in diasporic literature and oral storytelling, as reflected in the examples of life writing included in this exhibition, is the tension between the home lost through the process of migration and the new home in which the migrant has settled. Loss, longing, nostalgia, uncanniness, and disorientation are recurrent emotional themes in the experiences and stories of people living in diaspora, as is the feeling of never being fully home, of living in between worlds, of never quite fitting in anywhere, perhaps even growing wary of the complicated project of belonging. As Trinidadian-Canadian writer Dion Brand writes in her exploration of being in Canada's Black diaspora in her book, The Map to the Door of No Return, quote, "My body feels always in the middle of a journey," unquote. Diasporic experiences are also marked, as the editors of the Journal of South Asian Diaspora note, quote, "by tensions and struggles over meanings," unquote, both among people living in diaspora and with people in the countries where the diasporics now inhabit. These tensions and struggles over meanings are tangible in the relationships between some of the texts included in this exhibition and dominant discourses about belonging and identity within Quebec. This should not come as a surprise. These tensions and struggles over meaning arising out of the interaction between settler diasporic, settler colonial, and Indigenous peoples are shaped by distinct worldviews, power hierarchies, histories, dispossessions, and persecutions, and shifting access to land, water, cultural capital, social services, and social and economic mobility. As mentioned earlier, while in the rest of Canada, the South Asian experience has been documented and explored with some rigor, this has not been the case in Quebec. The editors of The Invisible Community advanced several hypotheses for why this might be. This might be related to the fact that only 6% of South Asian Canadians live in Quebec, where they represent approximately 1% of the population. Moreover, because of the long history of British colonialism in South Asia, South Asians are more likely to have English rather than French as their language of public use. South Asians also have an extremely high concentration in Montreal, making their presence in Quebec's more rural regions less common. Finally, South Asian immigration to Quebec is generally more recent than in the rest of Canada. Despite these factors, the growth of the South Asian community in Quebec, combined with the fact that South Asians in this province face particular challenges as they seek to integrate into Quebec society, suggests that there is value in learning about the distinct histories and experiences of South Asians here. To be sure, the challenge of integrating into a dominantly and officially French-speaking society is no small matter when both the historical and current contexts in their countries of origin have better prepared them to participate in English-speaking societies. Here I'm quoting from the editors of The Invisible Community. What is more, the banning of public workers in positions of authority from wearing religious symbols as of 2019 with Bill 21 severely affects, many would say targets, Quebec's South Asians, specifically Sikhs from India who wear the turban and Muslims from Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh who wear the hijab. Finally, Quebec's policy of interculturalism, which stands in contrast to Canada's policy of multiculturalism, creates a distinct context for integrating into society as an immigrant here, or refugee, I should add. For much of the 20th century, racially restrictive immigration laws prevented large-scale South Asian migration to Quebec, though some South Asians were able to immigrate to the province to help meet demands for university professors and doctors in particular. By 1961, there were 165 South Asians living in Quebec. Nigam, whose migration story is included within the life writing section of this exhibition, and who's also my grandmother, and her late husband Vijay Nigam were some of these early migrants from South Asia. Vijay came from India via the United States as a PhD in biochemistry to work doing cancer research, first at the Université de Montréal, and then at the Université de Sherbrooke, as part of this early trickle of South Asian immigrants in Quebec. It was not until after 1967, however, that Canada's immigration laws, which had previously discriminated against immigrants hailing from outside of Europe, were relaxed. Thus, the first numerically substantial wave of South Asian migration to Quebec didn't occur until after this year. This was during the aftermath of Expo 67 when, as the editors of The Invisible Community write, quote, Quebec repositioned its identity both locally in Canada and globally as a modern nation. And here I've pulled a few images from the Banque. Here we have some Indian spectators taking in the sights outside the India Pavilion at Expo 67. And here we have Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau welcomed at Expo 67 by receiving the tilaka, the tikka, at the India Pavilion as a way of honoring him as he's entering. And here's the India Pavilion itself. And then we have a hostess at the Ceylon Pavilion at Expo 67. The South Asians that came to Quebec as part of this post-1967 wave were professionals, namely university professors, doctors, and students who were seen as essential drivers of scientific, medical, and technological development in Quebec. By 1981, the population had grown to 16,541 people. After this point, religious and ethnic conflicts across South Asia led to new waves of immigration and refuge seeking in Quebec, and the South Asian population in the province became increasingly socioeconomically diverse. However, as McGill Professor of Education Ratna Ghosh explains in a text she authored for this exhibition titled South Asian Integration in Quebec, Some Contexts and Challenges, most South Asian immigrants have preferred to settle in English-speaking provinces where they have faced fewer barriers to economic and social participation, in part due to language. The adoption of Bill 101 in 1977, Ghosh writes, which made French the language of school education and employment, resulted in an exodus of people from Quebec, including many South Asians, and further redistributed South Asians towards the rest of Canada. Here I'll read from Ghosh's text that she's written for the exhibit. Findings suggest that Quebec's adoption of policies of linguistic integration since the 1970s have not generally worked to favor the economic and educational integration of South Asians in the province. Indeed, in the French educational sector, South Asian students are among the lowest performers, whereas in the English educational sector in Quebec and North America at large, South Asians are among the highest performers. While differences in social class and capital may account partially for this disparity, the problem of educational integration in Quebec is a matter of great concern for South Asian families, as most South Asian students will attend French schools, and non-French speaking new immigrants will not be able to assist their children with their homework. The high unemployment rate and low median income of the South Asian community in Quebec, despite their higher than average educational credentials observable in the 2016 Statistics Canada census, is also cause for concern. These realities indicate systemic discrimination that manifests in part through a lack of culturally sensitive infrastructure to support the societal integration of South Asians in Quebec. While existing legislation has so far presented several obstacles to the integration of South Asians into Quebec society, better language learning programs and a rethinking of immigration and language legislation might remove some of these obstacles to favor the economic and social integration of immigrants and refugees in the province. In a text titled On Orientalism, White Saviors, and Feminism in Quebec, Resisting Harmful Stereotypes in La Belle Province, that I have written for this exhibition, I explore the effects of the discourses around Bill 21 in Quebec on Muslim women in the province, many of whom are South Asian. The bill, which passed in 2019, bans civil servants in positions of authority like public school teachers, police officers, judges, and government lawyers from wearing religious symbols such as hijabs, turbans, and kippas while at work. Public debates about the bill, as well as the bill itself, have been steeped in many harmful, often Orientalist attitudes about the need to, quote, save Muslim women in particular from what the West has tended to view as their primitive and oppressive cultures. Orientalism is the process by which people in the West define themselves in contrast to Eastern societies. By framing Eastern societies as inherently more primitive, savage, violent, backwards, and animalistic in comparison to Western societies, the West is able to define itself as everything that is the opposite of the East, namely intellectual, moral, civilized, advanced, superior, human. White saviorism refers to the condescending motivation that leads a white person to attempt to help a racialized person under the assumption that the former knows what is best for the latter. Among the most pervasive examples of white saviorism in the West, as Columbia professor and pioneer of post-colonial studies Gayatri Spivak has famously observed, are recurring moments in which people in the West see it as their feminist and civilizing duty to, quote, save brown women from brown men, unquote. The dominant discourses surrounding Bill 21 in Quebec demonstrated both Orientalist and white saviorist attitudes by which the Quebec government and dominant Quebec society decided what was best for Muslim women living here. The irony is that research has demonstrated that the passing of Bill 21 has in fact been most devastating for Muslim women in Quebec. As Miriam Taylor, lead researcher and the director of publications and partnerships at the Association for Canadian Studies, has explained, with Bill 21, quote, we saw severe social stigmatization of Muslim women, marginalization of Muslim women, and very disturbing declines in their sense of well-being, their ability to fulfill their aspirations, sense of safety, but also their hope for the future, unquote. The research revealed that of the hundreds of Muslim women surveyed, 78% said their feeling of being accepted as a full-fledged member of Quebec society had worsened over the last 3 years. 53% said they'd heard prejudicial remarks about Muslims from family, friends, or colleagues, and 2/3 of Muslim women said they'd been a victim of and or witness to a hate crime. While Bill 21 has been celebrated as a feminist law by its supporters, the experiences and the opinions of the women who are most affected by this law remain largely ignored or silenced by the media and the people who support the law. Fights against the silencing of women's voices and the suppression of women as political actors have, of course, been some of the most important struggles of the feminist movement worldwide. So these are some of the broad sociological and historical contexts that are explored in different ways by different authors in Being South Asian in Quebec. And at this point, I'd like to give you some snapshots of a few key events marking South Asian history in Quebec, explored in the histories section of this exhibition. In his text, Muslims in Montreal and the Foundation of the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University, A Very Brief History, McGill professor Pasha M. Khan discusses the history of Muslim migration to Quebec during slavery, and then in the 1920s and 1930s in La Petite Syrie in Montreal along Notre-Dame Street between Saint-Laurent Boulevard, or the Main, and Berry Street. And then following World War II, when racially restrictive immigration laws were relaxed. He then turns to the foundation of the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill in 1952 by Professor Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who had just previously been in Lahore. And Smith, he would bring to Montreal a succession of Muslim scholars, many of whom were from South Asia. And together they forged a diverse community that included people from all over South Asia. In a second text for the exhibit, Khan explores the fascinating history of the Satis, a unique band of Desi, or South Asian, and racialized queer friends that came together in Montreal in the 1990s in the context of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, when members of the queer community were losing families and friends in staggering numbers. Here I read from Khan's text. Meaning companions in Urdu Hindi, the Satis coalesced as part of a larger wave of Desi queer grassroots activism across North America that responded to rising levels of homophobia following the outbreak of the virus. As Khan writes, the Satis were known for their fabulous parties, which helped to create spaces of community, fun, and joy for building a resilient queer community in turbulent times. And here we have an image of the Satis marching in Fierté, Montreal in 1997, carrying a tie-dyed banner. I'm going to continue with an excerpt from Khan's text. Throughout 1996 and 1997, Khan writes that the Satis recited poetry, played music, and danced at live performances they called darbars. In English, this means like holding court. Writing about Darbar 2, held at a downtown gay club at 1584 St. Catherine Street called Club Mississippi on August 2nd, 1997, Himmat Singh said, it's a cabaret with everyone joining in different directions, some more fierce than others. There's this classic idea of South Asians as submissive, mysterious, and sensual, but there are other facets to be explored. At Darbar 2, Shinat read erotic verse. Iranian ally Shaheen Parhami played the guitar, and Suleiman danced the forbidden dance, a loose and sensual dance that involved many spins that emerged out of colonial Brazil. By the early 2000s, many of the Satis had moved away from Montreal to other parts of Canada, but many of those who left were able to keep in touch with those who stayed. And when the Satis have returned, they have gathered together for new fabulous parties. Another important part of South Asian history in Quebec is explored in this exhibit, and that's the history of Tisri Dunya. And here I'm going to read from the text that's been written by founder of Tisri Dunya, Rahul Varma, who's also a South Asian Montreal playwright. Established in 1981 in the Plateau Mont-Royal neighborhood of Montreal by playwrights Rana Bose and Rahul Varma, Tisri Dunya Theatre is a multicultural theatre company committed to diversity, inclusion, and decolonization. Having begun as a South Asian company that produced plays in Hindi, the theatre company has developed to produce works that explore critical local Quebecois and Canadian political issues like racism, sexism, climate change, queer rights, human rights, and social justice. Since its inception, Tisri Dunya Theatre has produced more than 70 original plays. These include the winner of the Governor General's Award for Drama, for Where the Blood Mixes by Kevin Loring, Laka Pamuk's Lytton First Nation, and nominee for the Governor General's Award for Drama, Reading Hebron by Jason Sherman. The diverse repertoire of Tisri Dunya works to amplify the voices of underrepresented communities and to give work to theatre practitioners that have been largely excluded from mainstream Canadian and Quebecois theatre. The company also regularly carries out art-based community projects, including Project Leave Out Racism in 2020 and Artists United Against Racism in 2021-2022, address the rise of Islamophobia, anti-Asian, anti-Black, and anti-Indigenous racism in Quebec. Tisri Dunya Theatre, Varma writes, is a cultural and social space that serves to build community, foster critical thinking, and promote change towards a more inclusive society. In the stories section of the exhibition, the reader can find a text written by my father, Jody Nigam, chef owner of the Indian restaurant Shalimar in Lennoxville in the Eastern Townships, in which he reflects on over 30 years of serving Indian food in rural Quebec. The reader will also find a playful text from a fashion model, Humari Moon, who guides the reader through her process of negotiating her identity as a transgender Bangladeshi Quebecer, as she puts together an outfit that expresses her sense of self. And a choreography by Rameez Karim, a queer Montreal-based Indo-Kenyan Bollywood choreographer and teacher, as well as a performer based in Montreal. In which he explores his relation to the labels he has been given throughout his life using the medium of dance. Other topics covered in the exhibition include stories of relocation from Pakistan and India, as well as testimonies from the survivors of the 1947 partition of India, of British India, which was one of the most violent political upheavals and migrant crises in human history, really. You can also find a text about the relocation of Nepali-speaking Bhutanese refugees across 4 medium-sized regional towns in Quebec, including Saint-Jérôme, Joliette, Quebec City, and Sherbrooke. We hope that the exhibit will bring many learnings and spark new research and curiosity about the growing number of South Asians who call Quebec home. Thank you again to Quan for supporting our efforts to unearth and visibilize this part of Quebec heritage. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunita. How wonderful. It's so interesting. I encourage all of you to please turn your cameras back on. I'm sure you might have a few questions for Sunita, and you can use, again, the reactions button at the bottom of your page. If you're unfamiliar with Zoom and you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go like this. Just wave your hands around. That's perfectly fine too. And I'll try to keep watch out for you. So that you can come on and ask your questions, or you can just type in your comments in the chat box again at the bottom of your screen. Sunita, I'll start off the questions. You mentioned that people come to Quebec with stories of loss and longing, and you grew up with family that came here. And I wondered if you yourself have heard those kinds of stories from your own grandparents or great-grandparents.
Yes, I very much grew up very close to my grandparents who immigrated from India in the 1960s. And yeah, their stories, they had a lot of stories. I think that people who, have parents who are immigrants grow up with a lot of stories of back home, right? And certainly there were many stories about the home that can't be returned to, right? The home that was left and that's no longer there because physically things have changed, but also because time has passed, right? And so when you return, it's not the same home that they're returning to every time. And so I think that, and this is something you see a lot in a lot of diasporic literature in general about this kind of impossibility of returning home or returning back to the origin, or also potentially sometimes the really complicated feelings around that for those who've left home because of persecution or war or conflict or being not being kind of excommunicated from their families or their social circles. And so certainly, yes, I grew up here. But I grew up with I was raised by many immigrants who had grown up elsewhere. So I think my experience was there was a lot of switching between modes of thinking about this place and about, well, what my home is in relation to also the people that I call home, or the people that kind of function as home for me. They have other different homes that I don't know. And so I think, yeah, thinking about the experience of being in diaspora is definitely something that I grew up with.
Have there been oral histories done with the community? I know it's very diverse, but has there been any attempt at recording some of these stories of people who came in the 60s and their experiences and keeping them in an archive somewhere?
Well, I started to do some with members of my family, and some of that is part of, I have an aunt who started to do that with members of the family who have passed away now. So I'm grateful that she did that before me. And now I'm doing that a little bit. And my grandmother's story is included, and her story of migration and resettlement is included in this exhibition. And then we also will have several stories from that period. We'll have some or for a little bit after, some stories from partition survivors will be joining. They're in the process of being collected, and they're going to be joining the exhibition once they have been. And then otherwise, there are kind of more recent stories of included in this exhibition, some from some members of Rung in particular, about their, processes of migration and resettlement here in Quebec that are all complicated in different kinds of ways. Yeah.
It's good to know because the English community has such a tradition of recording our immigration stories. And of course, a lot of us are from Ireland and England and then maybe Europe and that sort of thing. So keeping the tradition of collecting stories is so important. And I'm very happy to hear that it's being continued and can be cataloged and archived somewhere so that it can create other exhibitions for sure.
Yeah, I think I think that's definitely something I think a lot of us are realizing in the South Asian community here, that we live, all of us, with so many stories, and just what do we do with them? How do we make sure they just don't go into the ether and are lost, right? And I think that's something that a lot of us think about. I see Pasha has a hand up.
Pasha, yeah, we'll unmute Pasha just a sec. There you go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm Pasha. I'm a member of the Rung Collective, and I'm a professor at McGill. And I just wanted to say that, although this is a Rung project, Sunita did by far the lion's share of the work, and it's so wonderful to be seeing. I mean, we're also seeing for the first time, some of the Rung members what she's done. So, I just wanted to give a big up to Sunita for that. And I wanted to. I mean, I have a question for you, Sunita, because one of the things about your family is that they own a restaurant, right? And you've talked a little bit about that in your presentation, but restaurants are really important to the history of South Asians in the diaspora, right? I mean, so there's a great book, for example, about like South Asian history on the east coast of the United States from the end of the 19th century, called Bengali Harlem. And a lot of the archival work that he does, or a lot of the research that he does, is on the basis of restaurants that existed in Manhattan, from the 1930s, 1940s onward, right? So South Asians, even if we give up our clothes or our languages, it's hard to give up our food, right? And so these restaurants have been really important sites of memory for the South Asian diaspora. I'm wondering whether you could talk a little bit about Shalimar Restaurant and your family's relationship with South Asian food. Yeah.
That's such a great question. And now all I want to do is do a new project where I just go across Quebec doing a history of all of the South Asian restaurants across, especially in rural Quebec. I think that would be so interesting. I'm going to be short. I mean, if you did, we just did rural Quebec. But yeah, food. Yes. My family is obsessed with food. I think a lot of immigrant families, I hear stories like this as well from them. I think it's a way of, I think we talked about, with Heather's question earlier, I talked a little bit about this experience of being in diaspora, being away from home, feeling unsettled. I think like home, food is one of the ways in which people stay connected to their families and to their homes. With family recipes, or the aromas that they grew up smelling in their kitchens, and the rituals of, making the samosas, or, rolling the chapatis, or whatever it is, or learning those practices from, often it was women, of course, other women in the family. So I think that there's something about food reaches us in a really intimate place. And a very emotional place, I think, for a lot of us. So I think, and I know with my grandmother, there's something about Indian food that's very like stretchy, like it's easy to stretch out to serve to feed a lot of people. So my grandmother growing up, she was always like, she had 4 teenagers in rural Quebec, and they all had a bunch of friends, and they from all around the eastern townships, and who were not Indian and didn't really grow up in eating those kinds of flavors, and so they always wanted to be over at my grandmother's house, like eating the Indian food with my dad and his siblings. And so my grandmother would always have an extra 4, 5, 6, 7 mouths to feed, but she would always stretch the food so that everyone could eat by making more chapatis or a little bit more rice, or bringing out another pickle, or making a kachumber, a little salad to go on the side, or having more yogurt or whatever, bringing out desserts. So I think there's something also being about like togetherness and gathering that feels also very familial and community building about food. So I think it makes sense that that immigrants and refugees that it would be so important for them when they go somewhere completely new. I mean, my grandma, and now I travel with my spices now, where my grandmother taught me to do that. So like if I'm going anywhere in the world, I'll have my Indian spices so I can make Indian food when I'm there. And my grandmother has stories of when they first moved to North America, they moved to Boston or to Brookline. And at that point, you couldn't find Indian spices in a grocery store, but she found this steak seasoning, and she was looking at the ingredients at the back of the bottle of the steak seasoning, and she was like, okay, there's coriander in here, there's fennel in here, there's chili in here. Like, I'm gonna go. So she got my she drove. She got my granddad in the car. They drove to the factory that made the steak spice and was like, can you sell me all of these spices separately? And that was like what her priority number one when they landed in North America. She's like, okay, I need to organize my spices in my kitchen and my cupboard. And then when my grandmother initially started the restaurant as a hobby, which was silly in retrospect because restaurants are a lot of work. And because she was always having people over, and everyone was always saying, you're such a good cook and we don't get to eat Indian food in this region, and why you should open a restaurant. And after years of that, finally the kids were grown up, and she was like, oh, maybe it's something I could do. And then it quickly became very popular and became way too much work very quickly. And then my dad, he was kind of not really, things weren't, flourishing in his job at the time. So he came to lend a hand, and then he ended up running the restaurant for now the last 30 years as the chef owner, with now my stepmother, Lizzie, and her brother, and who's from South India, and her stepbrother, and her brother and his wife, who are also from Kerala. So it's really become a family restaurant. I worked in the restaurant growing up. My brothers did. The kids of my aunt and uncle have. So it's been a family restaurant. It's generated a lot of employment for us, and it's insanely popular. It's really busy every night. So it's a booming business. And my partner just went and ordered takeout from there for tonight. So after this, I'm going to go have some Shalimar takeout. I see Kanata has a hand up. Oh,
okay. There you go.
I'm unmuted. So I think in the earlier days of South Asian immigration, the restaurants were also a site for people to connect and to find each other. And maybe now with social media and all these other ways of communicating, that's less so. But I just like to point out to everyone that Shalimar Restaurant is how Rang Collective and Sunita came to meet each other. So we had a grant from Elan for which we needed a partner who was not based in Montreal, who was based elsewhere in Quebec, and we couldn't find anyone. And so I got on Google Maps I found the restaurants of Quebec, the Indian restaurants of Quebec, and then I started looking up their owners. And that's how we found Sunita. And yeah, that was pretty amazing. And yeah, I'm so happy that the story of the restaurant has also now been documented and is a part of the exhibit.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Connie.
and I was going to say it was the Shalapar restaurant was my introduction to Indian food. Living out here in rural Quebec, grew up on meat and potatoes, the Irish diet, and it just opened my world to something quite different. So food is a wonderful topic, and I would encourage you to please do something with that. We have a couple of questions coming in from Facebook too, Sunita. Actually, they're both from Raymond. I'll ask the first, and then he has a second. Many South Asians I know have left the province. I stayed. Why did you decide to remain?
Okay. Well, so personally, I was born here. I was born in Quebec. So, my relationship to that question will be different, right? And my motivations and my reasons. I guess I could say a little bit about why my family stayed and then why I'm staying. So my family, my grandfather had a job at the University of Sherbrooke. He came here for work. He was first employed at the University of Montreal and then the University of Sherbrooke here. He had a good job and he just wanted, his family and his kids, his grandkids to have a stable, secure life. And they bought an old farmhouse in North Hatley in the Eastern Townships, and it was beautiful, like on the river, and they figured out how to farm, and they figured out how to grow flowers, and they figured out how to do all of the things, and they learned how to camp, and they learned how to they kind of saw it as an adventure. My grandparents were really adventurous people. My grandmother still is an adventurous person, and yeah, they approached it as an adventure. And they were able to have, pretty good life here. Their kids and grandkids as well. For us, it's been, some of the kids ended up in Ontario, but not necessarily because of the French. Most of them went to university or in French. So I don't know. It's for me in the Eastern Townships. The cost of living is pretty low. You don't have to be a house poor if you can afford a house. It's beautiful, and I have people here. I have friends and I have family. In terms of, but I know, we know a lot of South Asians who have left because of issues around employment and the French language, not just having French, but even with French, it's even if you have a certain level of French, if you have an accent, that can be an issue for certain fields. And so they've navigated that. I think a lot of them have tried to make it work, especially the kind of people who have arrived in the last 10 or 15 years. We've seen a few families come to Quebec from South Asia and then try to make it work here with their kids and with themselves, and then after trying for a while, realize, well, they can have a better job and better kind of community social integration in other parts of Canada. So we've seen lots of examples of both happening, actually. So yeah.
And then Raymond also asked, I remember during my bishop's days going to your parents' restaurant. How did your family end up in Lennoxville? That was the question I was curious about back in the late 90s.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's because my grandfather got the job at the University of Sherbrooke. And then so they were like, I guess we're moving to rural Quebec. And so they was like, let's go, kids. And they had been living in Longueuil for a few years before that and had really enjoyed their neighbors and their time in Longueuil, and their neighbors, taught them how to go camping and how to do all of these things that they, didn't grow up doing. And so I think it was a little bit of an adjustment. I think they had a little more community when they were in Longueuil. There was, it's a little harder, in a rural place. It's beautiful, but they're just not as many people. I think for all of us, some of us really welcome that. I think it's hard when you're a young family and you're new to a place. Like, I think, making friendships and all of that wasn't always easy. Yeah, I think things definitely would have been different if they had stayed in a more urban area. I'm not sure if it would have been different, good or bad. I think it just would have been different.
Thanks, Raymond. Those were good questions. Raymond says thank you. You mentioned the Tesri Dunya Theater. Is it an actual location, a place you can actually go to see theater?
Yeah, they have a dedicated theater space, but they also present productions in different theater venues. So I went to see one at the Segal Center last year. They had they were producing a play called Counter Offense at the Segal Center last year. I'm sure there are many other places that they've produced performances in, but there is a space. Where is the space? Kanata and Pasha, could you fill in the information?
We'll unmute you, Pasha, just a sec. There.
It's on Avenue des Pins and it's on Des Pins and Parc in Montreal. It's the former it was the nunnery, it was this convent basically, which is now being rented out to P Street.
Yeah, so it's a former convent, but if you look at their website, I think sometimes you'll see that they'll have productions in other venues or activities in other spaces as well. So I think, so there's an actual space there as well.
And do the Sathis come in at certain times of year? Should you have a party? Are they an organized also a place where they gather and meet and support one another, or is it's something that's more disorganized and it's just for events?
That's a question for Pasha again. Sorry.
Okay. Hang on. There you go.
Yeah, so we're recording. We've gotten a whole bunch of photos and even the banner that they held up at Pride in 1997. And so basically what happened was that after around 2000, some of the Satis started going outside of Quebec, so to Ottawa, to BC, to the US in one case. And so the group kind of dispersed, but there were a couple of people who stayed in Montreal. And now there are people who are actually coming back to Montreal just because they feel that sense of community as well, or because their parents are still here in some cases, and they want to come back to take care of their elderly parents. And so recently they've been having get-togethers. I'm in the plateau. Let's say I won't give you my address,
oh, no.
but one of them is living just down the street, and so recently he's been having get-togethers of some of the members who are in town or people who come into town. There, or there's another member in La Salle. Himmat is in La Salle, and he's had get-togethers with Punjabi pizza for some of the former members over there. But it was a really interesting and cool group because they had these talent shows. They would put on this poetry, and they would do drag and all kinds of things that stereotypically you wouldn't associate with South Asians, and a majority of them were actually not from India but from Pakistan. So that's another interesting thing about the Sati group.
I'm delighted to hear that there's collecting going on of all the activities that people do. in my former life, I was a museum curator. So it's for me, objects are the things that tell the stories and the oral histories. And so to hear that, the banner's been saved and posters, and it's all reflective of the wider and vibrant and colorful community. It's really quite wonderful. I was wondering, and other questions have come in too, as where can we see the exhibit? Is it online? Is there an address we can go to? Is it a physical place?
It will be online, and it's not yet up. But so I will be keeping you posted, Heather, so that as soon as it's ready to go, you can share it. You can share it with people, and then in the future, we would like to explore developing it into something physical, maybe an outdoor exhibit. That'll be, funding dependent, and we'll see what the future lives could be. So I think that the online exhibit certainly will be the first iteration. Once it's ready to go, I will share it with you, and then potentially it could be any number of other things, or could be a performance. It could be, it could be integrated and disseminated in different kinds of ways.
Please do, Sunita, because I know it's such an interest to people to explore other cultures and get to know people on a more intimate level through their art and dance and poetry. And it's really important for Quebecers to expand their viewpoint of what it means to be a Quebecer and a Canadian, and reach out across the great divides that we have. And it's wonderful to have just a glimpse of the exhibit. I'm really excited about it. So indeed, we'll make sure that we put the links up once you have them for us on Quan's heritage line. I'm sure we can do that for you, and keep connected. I don't think there are any other questions, so I'll bring this evening's talk to a close by thanking you, Sunita, for a wonderful presentation and bringing us into such a diverse and colorful and creative community. And I really appreciate the time that you've given to us this evening to share your knowledge, and it's just wonderful to meet up with you again. We've worked on other projects before, and it's been a long time since I've been over to the Shalimar, so I'll make sure I go very soon. But thank you to all of you that have joined us this evening. This is our last presentation, actually, in our series of Heritage Talks. So this has been a nice way to wrap it up for our 2024 season. And we've had a really great time learning about the amazing projects and the important work going on in the cultural communities in Quebec and in the heritage sector as well, in historical societies and museums and archives. And again, if you've missed any of our talks, please go to our Facebook page. It's a public site. You don't need a Facebook page of your own to see the past recordings. And you can go to our YouTube channel as well, Quan's YouTube channel, and you can watch this one and all the others again. And so I'd like to thank Allison Kirkwood, who runs our tech today and making sure everything flows smoothly for us. And it's been a pleasure working with you, Allison. And again, Sunita, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our viewers who have joined Heritage Talks for our season. And I wish you all a good night. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Heather and Allison. Have a great night.